Question 2, Honourable Member for Douglas Central, Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr President. I beg leave to ask the Chief Minister what rights holders of the Isle of Man British passports have to the Isle of Man and of abode in the Isle of Man.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. Holders of an Isle of Man British passport, also referred to as a variant British passport, are British citizens. British citizenship is conferred, by the British Nationality Act 1981. Under the Immigration Act 1971, which has been extended to the Isle of Man, British citizens, whether they hold an Isle of Man British passport or not, have the right to abode in the Isle of Man and shall be free to live in and to come and go into and from the Isle of Man. The Emergency Powers Coronavirus Entry Restrictions No. 2 Regulations 2020, as continued by the Emergency Powers Coronavirus Continuation No. 2 Regulations 2020, impose restrictions on entry to the Isle of Man regardless of any freedoms that any individual had prior to them coming into force. These regulations were made by the Governor and Council under Section 4 of the Emergency Powers Act 1936, following a proclamation of a state of emergency under Section 3 of that Act. As well as some other limited exceptions, residents are permitted to return to the island, but this is based on residency rather than a passport held. Thank you.
Supplementary, Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr President. I appreciate the Chief Minister explaining nationality, immigration and the restrictions currently on abode and entry under the emergency powers. Is the Chief Minister concerned that he's choosing between passport holders, Isle of Man British passport holders, on the basis of the entry restrictions?
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr. I don't think we are choosing between. If you're not a resident, if you're not on the voting list, if you and you want to come to visit, it doesn't matter whether you have a British passport or a Manx issued passport. You can't come. There are exceptions, but those exceptions allow for British passport holders as well. I can't see any difference between the two passports. If the honourable member could maybe give me an example, I'm more than happy to look into it.
Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr President. Does the Chief Minister not accept that talking about our people as being merely people who are resident on the Isle of Man rather than people who have Isle of Man British or variant British passports is a bit dangerous and might be perceived quite badly with the people who have that status?
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr President. We've always been clear, or I thought we were clear, that we were protecting, our number one concern was protecting the residents of the Isle of Man. That's the people who are residents, who are on the register to vote is one example, or can show that they have a lease if they want, or for a property, or buying a property, more than welcome to come and live here. So we have set a number of criteria, and the criteria is for people who are on the island. There are thousands of people who have Isle of Man born on their passport, but that doesn't make them residents of the island. So I can't really say any more than that.
Mr Thomas.
One final time then. So do I understand, Mr President, that the Chief Minister is completely unconcerned that our people are residents, people on the voting list, but not people who have Isle of Man British or British variant passports? So, for instance, a young person who's across, who can't afford to buy a property here or rent a property for a long time, hasn't got the same rights as somebody who hasn't gone across 18 months ago or 2 years ago. Does the Chief Minister agree that that person is less of our people than somebody who has stayed here? Does the Chief Minister also then believe that Isle of Man British or variant British people from the island who went away don't have the same rights as key workers and other people who can come to the Isle of Man?
Chief Minister.
Thank you. I see the honourable member is trying to get a point that we've abandoned people who were born here but no longer live on the Isle of Man. And we have to make a decision on protecting, that was our number one concern, those people that were resident on the Isle of Man. Now, it is my sincere hope that as soon as data and the situation further afield improves, that we will be able to allow people to come to the island who are family, and doesn't have to be people who were born on the Isle of Man, but people who have loved ones on the Isle of Man to be able to come over here. But for the time being, I feel that the measures that we've put in place are the best we can do. Nothing is perfect in this world, and I think the measures we've put in place are good for the people of the Isle of Man. And I think it's unfortunate that the Honourable Member is trying to drive a wedge here. Yes, we have lots of people who no longer live here, and I'm sure if it's your child living in the UK, paying UK tax, renting a house or living in a house, then I'm sure they would like them to come back to the Isle of Man. And if they want to come back full-time, they can. It's only visiting that they can't. So anyone can come back to the Isle of Man to live, to rent, and if they can't afford to do that, as the Honourable Member suggested, then they could live with family. How are they living in the UK? They must be paying a rent or owning a property. So it's maybe an unfortunate point to make, but it's the reality that we are having to live with in a not far from perfect world.
Honourable Member Miss Edge.
Thank you, Mr President. Just really to follow on from the Honourable Member for Douglas Central, is the Chief Minister aware that Isle of Man passport holders on compassionate grounds are being refused entry?
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr President. There are a clear set of rules and regulations which we have for officers to deal with. I, as a politician, do not get involved in the appeals and the applications from members of the public. That's between the Chief Secretary and his team that deal with that. So I cannot interfere in individual cases. If the Honourable Member feels a member of the public off Ireland has been treated unfairly, then I'm more than happy to ask the Chief Secretary to look at that.
Honourable Member Mrs Barber.
Thank you, Mr President. I wonder if the Chief Minister could comment on the compliance against the wording that sits within the Manx passports that says Her Britannic Majesty's Lieutenant Governor of the Isle of Man requests and requires in the name of Her Majesty all those whom it may concern to allow the bearer to pass freely without let or hindrance and to afford the bearer such assistance and protection as may be necessary, and how that ties in with the decisions that have been made and the policies adopted.
Chief Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr President, I thought I'd already answered that in my initial speech, which shows that the Emergency Powers Coronavirus Entry Restrictions No. 2 Regulations 2020 impose restrictions on entry regardless of any freedoms that any individual had prior to them coming into force.
Final supplementary, Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr President. Would the Chief Minister then encourage his officers to use all their discretion available to them under the law through the Chief Secretary to enable Isle of Man British passport holders to be able to come home when people can't afford to buy a property or rent a property for a year and haven't got a job, to enable a bit more care to be taken for Isle of Man British passport holders, young people who are exactly the sort of people we need to be filling those teachers, healthcare workers and policemen.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr President. I was under the impression that if someone wanted to relocate to the Isle of Man, if they had somewhere to live and they could prove they had somewhere to live and they were coming back to help contribute, as the Honourable Member says, to the island economy, then that was a case that they would be allowed. I do not get involved in individual cases, but we have to remember that there are many thousands of people waiting to come to the Isle of Man to visit their loved ones, and I totally get that. Christmas is approaching, and who doesn't want to see your mum, your dad, your brother, your sister, your grandparents? But we have to rely on the advice on what that risk means to those people living on the Isle of Man. And it's an absolute nightmare. I feel very sorry for the officers who have to make these decisions. It must be an absolute nightmare for them. But we have to make these decisions to protect the residents of the Isle of Man. And I look forward to the day when we see that the UK's infection rate has significantly introduced, that we can welcome loved ones from the adjacent island further afield onto the Isle of Man, but I'm afraid it isn't there at the moment.
Please like and subscribe to the Isle of Man TV channel. Thank you.